Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another Friday Night Figma. Only this time, again, we're going to be focusing on some more of the high-level user experience stuff. And it's been that way for about a week and a half now. I thought I would take a little bit of a break from focusing so much on Figma and instead zoom out a bit, instead to focus on some of the broader aspects of user experience design and user interface design, so we have more of a holistic understanding of what we are looking at and what we're talking about when we speak to others as UX professionals. And so I thought I would sort of zoom out as much as possible with this week's stream and talk about design thinking. And I'll go through each of the stages of the EDIPT, or the EDIPT phases that we typically see when we are first taught about user experience and how to incorporate design thinking into our tool set, so to speak. And in doing research for this stream, when I was coming up with all of the images and trying to find appropriate text for the slide deck, it became abundantly clear, and I knew this, but it sort of reinforced this fact that there are many definitions for what we're going to go over. And if your mental concept, if your mental map looks different than what I'm presenting here, bear in mind that there are multiple correct ways of thinking about all the topics that I'll be discussing this evening. And so there are no right and, well, there are some right and wrong answers. However, there's a lot of leeway when it comes to discussing these topics. So bear that in mind. Something I say doesn't exactly line up with the way you think about it, then that's perfectly acceptable, and vice versa. So just bear that in mind as we move forward. And so in this introductory slide, I wanted to, and as an illustration of that, I was able to, when I did a Google image search for design thinking graphs, I'm not exactly sure what the search query was, I found a number of visual manifestations of design thinking and different ways to conceptualize it. And as we can see here, I chose basically four pretty good representative images for different methodologies, different ways of thinking about design thinking. And this top left one, I snagged this one from the Nielsen Norman Group, nngroup.com, from their Design Thinking 101 series. And I like this one a lot, as it shows the sort of never-ending aspect of design thinking, because we have arrows going all which ways, and so we have arrows with wheels within wheels, arrows within arrows. And so as we can, I'll zoom in a bit here. There we go. As we can see, the empathize step moves into define, moves into ideate, prototype, test, and they add implement at the very end. But we can also see that there are arrows going in the previous direction. And so this illustration, I like this illustration a lot because it emphasizes the fact that design thinking is meant to be understood as it iterates forward, but you also go back some stages fairly frequently to reevaluate what you know and confirm what you think you know, and to also gather new information. So bear in mind, it's stepwise in the sense that you go from one phase to another. However, it's possible and frequent. It's a frequent occurrence that you would go back a phase, or it's a very fluid process. It flows both ways. The image, the illustration below that, this is a less formalized version of what we see here, and indeed what we see most of the time. And I chose this one because it's more of a simplification compared to the other ones that I chose. And I chose this one in order to illustrate the fact that the design thinking process can be visualized in a number of ways based on how complex you want to make it. And so this was the simplest manifestation, or it's the least complicated manifestation of design thinking I was able to see. However, in all of these images, you'll notice that they basically hit on most of the same points, and that is to say, the EDIPT, which is the name of the phases. We have empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test, and Nielsen Norman includes implement at the end of theirs. But again, we see down here EDIPT. We have the EDIPT flow of things. And to the right of that, we have an image that I snagged from Stanford's D School. It's their design school, very noted school of design. And they have a, we very frequently see these polygons used when looking for design thinking images. And they added a little bit of more detail to theirs, including things to keep in mind when you're in each phase. Some of these are, for define, for example, includes personas, role objectives, decisions. So personas, that would be a deliverable. And so some of these are deliverables. Some of these are just things to keep in mind, or, broad concepts of what each one of these phases is about. And so I think, oddly enough, I don't think this is designed that well. For example, we have so much white space between ideate and prototype, and white space between define and ideate, which is different than the white space between empathize and define, and again, prototype and test. And perhaps that was on purpose, and just looking at it, I can't tell what that purpose is. However, I found it odd that the D School would produce such a, I wouldn't say unprofessional, but not great looking image here. However, I found it to be useful as far as the information it conveys, and so that's why I chose to include this image. And then we're going to see this on the next slide. This is it's called the new double diamond model of design thinking, and I snagged this from ICF International. Well, I got it from a Medium article. However, it was developed at ICF. And this is kind of, I think it's called also like the smiley face model, because if you can almost see a smiley face here. I don't see it that easily unless I'm trying to. However, this is close to being my favorite version of a visual representation of what design thinking is, because it includes notably the divergence and convergence. It includes that information, and so at a glance you'll be able to tell what sort of thinking or what sort of decision making you'll be going through at any given point. And of course it also includes arrows that the steps go from left to right, and sometimes it's not clear why they chose some of the arrows. Again, I would say that define, you also have an arrow going between define and ideate, but that would kind of break the design a little bit. You'd have intersecting lines, and then I don't know, the point is none of these illustrations are perfect, because indeed it is very challenging to, again, visualize properly or correctly design thinking in a way that will assist all UX professionals, which is why I would suggest becoming acquainted and being able to, or I would suggest being acquainted and being able to read and understand each one of these different types of illustrations of the design thinking process. And again, this one is sort of my favorite so far, again, because of the reason that we have divergence and convergence, and it divides the design thinking process into two portions, more or less. We have a portion at the very beginning focusing on locating and understand the problem space, and the second part having to do, it's solution centric. And so this is I rather like this way of looking at things. And then of course, just as a friendly reminder, as it is the lips portion of this illustration, I suppose, we have human-centered at the bottom, which is helpful to it's helpful to remind the UX professional that at all times we need to keep the user in mind first and foremost. They are the most important aspect of all the work that we do, is focusing on the user. And so here's a slightly larger version of the previous double diamond image. And again, yeah, it says adding convergent, divergent thinking into the mix. And so there's much more information on this illustration than some of the other ones, or much more text, I should say. It's a text-heavy illustration, and so at first, on first blush, this may be, especially if you're new to the field of user experience, user interface design, this might seem a little bit overwhelming. However, the more you practice, the more projects you do, the more products you create, this will start to make sense over time. And so if there were just a couple of, the most important takeaways for a new designer would be understanding the difference between divergent and convergent, and what exactly are you considering at each point? Are you talking about the problem, or are you thinking about solutions? And so UX professional or UX designers at any skill level should be able to get something out of this illustration. And on the topic of divergence and convergence, I wanted to, I included this slide just to make sure that everyone watching is on the same page. I want to make sure that we're all using the same language and that we have at the very least, a similar understanding, or I can't think of the word, a similar understanding of what we're talking about when we use certain words. And so divergent thinking, and I'll just read from the slide here, divergent thinking is a thought process or method used to generate creative ideas by exploring many possible solutions. And for both of these, I got the definition just from Wikipedia. And as far as divergent thinking is concerned, brainstorming is a very popular example of this sort of thinking exercise. When we're doing divergent thinking, we are coming up with as many ideas as possible, and which can be difficult if you're working alone, if you happen to be siloed, or if you're a team of one. It can be difficult not having a team there or someone else to bounce ideas off of. However, it's still possible. It's very possible. Very often, especially in education tracks, depending on the institution that you are enrolled in, you may or may not have a team to assist you with the various phases. And so it's something to keep in mind, I suppose. And so you're coming up with all sorts of ideas. You welcome all thoughts, and there's no such thing as a bad idea. Very often, ideas that may seem not so great could turn out to be amazing, and you'll get a mix of ideas. Person A will come up with sort of a concept, person B will come up with a different concept, and you put them together and you have a new idea. And so this is when it's appropriate to think outside the box, so to speak. And the opposite of that, but still related, is convergent thinking, which is the type of thinking that focuses on coming up with the single, well-established answer to a problem. It is oriented toward deriving the single best or most often correct answer to a question. And again, definition from Wiki. And if I would change anything in this definition, I would state, or the change that I would make would be focusing the word here, single. Often when you are working on a project or working on a design, you'll be entertaining multiple problems, or you'll seek the best solution to a number of problems. It's not always a single problem. Very often you'll have multiple hypotheses that you'll want to develop a solution for going forward. And so it's not correct in the sense that you're only be working on one problem at a time, or trying to narrow down your pool of possible solutions to a problem. And so again, to reiterate, divergent is coming up with all sorts of answers to a question or to a problem, solutions to a problem, or answers to a question. And it's just accepting all answers, a lot of brainstorming, just a lot of writing, using up a lot of space on a whiteboard. And convergent is the opposite, where you are narrowing down. It's a narrowing down. It's a distillation of different thoughts and different ideas to determine what would be the most appropriate solution to a given problem or a given question. And to go back one slide here, now that we understand divergent and convergent thinking a bit better, we can see how, or we can see how each type of thinking process is used in each type of the design thinking process. And one thing to note is you'll notice that because this is the double diamond is named because of the alternate the going between divergence and convergence thinking. So we had divergence, then convergence, then divergence, then convergence, and that makes sense because it makes sense that convergence would follow divergence, because you want to again sort of expand and contract, come up with a bunch of answers or solutions, and then focus on the ones that work, and then do that again, and then focus on the ones that work again. And so it's sort of an accordion in that way, alternating. That's the word I was looking for. That's the word I was looking for. Alternating between divergence and convergence. And so that's what gives this illustration the double diamond name, or let's say nomenclature, but it gives it the double diamond named. And so let's see here. And now we will I will briefly focus on each one of the phases of design thinking, going from the EDIPT. And I won't get too in the weeds with each one of the phases. I don't want to, each phase could surely be its own stream, and so I want, again, to give a broad overview of the entire concept. And so as far as the first stage, which is the empathize phase, it's a divergent phase. And so in this phase, you're finding out, you as the UX professional, you're finding out everything you can about your users. This will allow you to form the right questions in order to solve the right problems. And so that's kind of, it's one thing to run spell check, but it's another thing to check for context. Let's do, and solve the right problems. There we go. And so this phase, the empathize phase, will allow you to form the right, it'll make sure that you form the right questions and solve the right problems. Stakeholders are also researched to identify their needs, and their needs will frequently be different than those of your users, and so that's something to keep in mind. Stakeholders will frequently have ideas, or they'll come to the table maybe with feature ideas that they think ought to be implemented, or they have financial concerns, or they may have concerns that are based on lengths of time or time to get to market, anything like that. And so because the stakeholders are the stakeholders, they may or may not take the form of your boss or investors or people who are very important to this process. You'll need to make sure that you'll need to identify their needs and their wants as well. And of course, it's a difficult time to try to please everyone. However, as a UX professional, you'll need to, at the very least, identify what each group, that is to say your stakeholders and your users, you'll need to identify their wants and their needs, their pain points, and all that good stuff. And so, and I underlined right questions and right problems, and that is very important to keep in mind, is that you don't want to skip any stage, of course. However, and I don't want to say that any one phase or stage of the design thinking process is more important than another. However, the empathize stage is first, and it's first for a reason, and that is, among other reasons, because without solid information on your users, and for that matter your stakeholders, you are likely to go into the product development cycle, or if you're working on a project, you're likely to solve for a question that isn't actually, that maybe not be that big of a deal, or that users don't necessarily care about, or you might be solving the wrong problem. And so when you get this step correct, when you do the appropriate amount of work in the empathize step, or empathize phase, you will start off on the right foot as far as focusing on, your focus will be directed in the correct way. You'll be by keeping an eye on the user and the stakeholders, you'll be answering the right questions, and you'll be designing toward the correct goal. That's what I'm getting at. And so tasks and deliverables when you're working in the empathize phase can include research plan or proposals. This is incredibly important, not only for you as the UX professional, because you might be the one who also does the research, depending on team size, all that good stuff. However, you'll also want to write your proposal or your plan in a way that the stakeholder can understand what you're doing and what you're proposing to do as far as research is concerned. And the idea here is, if you are working in an organization that doesn't have a great degree of UX maturity, that is to say, if your organization doesn't have an appreciation for what user experience design is for, having a well-written short, because stakeholders don't have all the time in the world, a well-written, concise proposal can, you're looking for buy-in, and that is to say you're looking to, again, in organizations where there's not a great deal of UX maturity, you're looking to, convince might not be the right verb, but you're looking to convey the importance of the research phase. Otherwise, it may seem, if you have a low UX maturity organization, the stakeholders might not understand the incredible value of user experience. And in order to sell them on that, in order to increase buy-in or to get buy-in, you'll want a concise, well-written research plan that lets them know who you're interviewing and why you're doing it and what you hope to learn from that. And a lot of this stuff was discussed more in detail last stream. I went into some of this stuff a lot more, and so another deliverable or / task that you'll be accomplishing is coming up with the screener. And screeners, of course, are a way to screen potential users for interviewing, and screeners will allow you, as if you're also the researcher, to make sure that you are talking to the right user base. And again, I won't go over every topic that I went over last stream. However, if you speak to the right users, if you interview the right people, you will that's going to, again, put you on the right path as far as understanding the right questions and the right problems. You'll want to do research or do interviews with users who are going to be a representative of who are going to look like the users that you're going to release the product to, the ones who are going to use the product. So if you are creating an app or a website or any sort of product like that that's geared toward medical professionals, possibly doctors or specialists or surgeons or whatever the case may be, you won't want to interview attorneys or astronauts or anything like that, because they won't be the appropriate cohort for research. And so screeners can help screen those people out and make sure that you're starting off on the right foot by interviewing the right people. And again, and also interviews right here. And so once you've done your screeners, this is sort of going in order, more or less. Once you have come up with your proposal, gotten the okay on it, you've written your screener, just screened all your people, and you have a cohort of people that you want to interview, you will do the interview process. And at that point, you will know what type of research that obviously you'll know what research you're doing, but you'll also have a good idea about what questions you need to ask. And the answers to those questions through this interview process will inform you as the UX researcher of the type of problems that each individual faces and some of the nuances thereof in that cohort, their problems as a whole. And this will give you deep insight, because it's certainly one thing to do secondary research and competitive analysis and quant and qual research. However, as far as getting extremely reliable information is concerned, and I'm not saying that those forms of research aren't reliable, but nothing beats actual user interviews and actual user research, because these are live people who may end up using your product, and so nothing beats that information. And that about sums it up for the empathize phase. And moving on to the define phase. This is when I was doing all the research to come up with these slides and choosing images and whatnot. The define phase, I guess ironically enough, was the least well-defined phase, and I understand it well enough to, understand why it has its own section, of course, in the design thinking, I guess, paradigm that exists. However, among all the different websites and all the professional websites I went to, this is the one that was sort of most, I wouldn't say disagreed upon. However, each resource that I went to had a different understanding of exactly what happens here, and so especially with this phase, huge old grain of salt as to what I'm about to say, because how you learned to conceptualize the defined phase, or what you learned about this phase, could be significantly different from how I'm presenting it here. However, and again, that's completely fine. So and the biggest issue that I saw was understanding, or sort of a bit of a disagreement between authors as to what exactly you do in this phase. And for example, synthesis is what I saw many writers say goes on in the define phase, and in other authors, other UX professionals, placed synthesis in the empathize, toward the end of the empathize phase. And so again, it's not overly important. You don't need to be, incredibly pedantic about where you put one of these things, because parts of this are sort of up to interpretation. However, more importantly, the big takeaway would be understanding the order things go in. And so you won't do any of your, what at least on this slide falls into the define phase, you won't do this until you're done with empathize. Or if you consider this stuff, empathy maps, personas, if you consider these deliverables part of the empathize phase, you still won't complete these deliverables. You won't work on them until the end, after you've done your interviews. And so that's the most important thing to understand here. But anyway, to read, this phase is all about taking what you've learned about the users and organizing it into understandable, shareable portions. And when I say shareable portions, that points to the types of deliverables that will be created. For example, you'll have your empathy map, you'll have your personas, and you'll have your HMW, your how might we questions, and these are shareable in the sense that you'll have these documents. You can make these in Figma or Google Docs or any number of design applications, design software. You will be able to disseminate these documents to other members of the team and members of other teams as well. It's a very good idea, for example, to share your personas, your empathy maps, even your how might we questions. You want to share those with your dev team, the people coding the front end and the back end, because they may not. It's entirely possible in an organization with a very high UX maturity level that you'll have a representative of your dev team present during the interview process. However, it's entirely possible that they won't be there, and so they won't necessarily, your dev team won't necessarily have firsthand knowledge of all of the questions and all of the possible answers that will arise from the work that goes on in the empathize stage, your user research. And so by creating, for example, these personas and these empathy maps, these artifacts that sort of encapsulate or crystallize information about the user, by sharing those with the dev team, they will also have a clearer picture of who they are designing for. And that can only help things if everyone is more or less on the same page with regard to who the user is, what the user looks like in a metaphorical sense. That will create, among other things, sort of cohesion between teams when everyone understands what they're working, who they're working for, the users, and what they're working toward. And so that's what I mean by shareable, and that you can share these with other team members. You can disseminate this information easily by these documents, by these artifacts. And so, and the creation of empathy maps and personas and how might we's are, the creation of that is also known broadly as synthesis. Synthesis in design thinking jargon is the sort of the putting together of all the information that's gathered during the research phases and organizing it in such a way that it's, again, sort of easily digestible. And so personas would be an example of the outcome of synthesis of all the research. And so also at this point, problem statements are generated here, or problem statements are generated at this point. And as I stated toward the beginning of the slide, some guides, and by guides I mean some articles or texts on design thinking, place the work done here in the empathy phase, which again, it's less important where it falls in each phase, because again, this is not the most, it's not wise to be pedantic as far as this stuff goes, because one of the big mottos of user experience is it depends. And of course, it depends on who you're talking to. And so one UX professional may disagree about where this stuff falls, but the takeaway is the order in which these things are done, where, whether or not these tasks and deliverables are more part of the empathize stage, or if they're more part of the define phase, is less important than understanding the order in which they're created. And whereas empathize is a divergent thought process area, define phase is convergent, because at this point you are taking all of your information that you've gained from your research, from your interviews, and you're putting all that information into, for example, a persona. And if you're not familiar with personas, personas are not based on, it's not, let's say that you do 5 interviews or 20 interviews, you're not going to have one persona per person. Personas are sort of the conglomeration of multiple people who, in the interview process, who share enough, who have enough in common to put them together sort of into one idea of the person. And so very often when you develop personas like this, you'll have a sort of a made-up name and an image it doesn't necessarily need to be tremendously representative of the accumulation of all these personality types and whatnot. But I've seen some personas that use not cartoons, but use fancy illustrations to draw the picture of a person, or sort of the Allegria style, if you're familiar with that art style that's been popular recently. And these days, you can develop, or you can come up with images for people in your personas that are from AI, just AI created people. And so this isn't one person, but rather it's the idea of numerous people, and it gives all the team members an idea of who they're working for. It's important, I would say that it's somewhat important to have an image of somebody, because it helps to have a face to go with the information on the persona. Because if you don't have an image right here and you just see Rory, well, that's more abstract than having this individual right here, where you can sort of have a more holistic view, or at least a more visually representative view of what Rory might look like. And so it sort of ties everything together. It brings some realism to your persona. And when on each of these slides, when I write tasks and deliverables can include, I wrote that to imply to the viewer that this certainly isn't an exhaustive list of all of the tasks or deliverables that will be created. But because of space limitations, I don't have all the space in the world to continue to add images ad nauseum, and illustrations for that matter. This is just sort of the most common deliverables that you may deal with having to create as a UX professional. And so let's move on to the next stage, the ideation phase. And we're back to divergent thinking. And this phase is all about coming up. Again, context versus spell check here. This phase is all about coming up with ways to solve the problems that you've identified. And this is another, because this is divergent thinking, much like the empathize phase, this is a scenario where it's wise to do a lot of brainstorming. There we go. Coming up with ways. There we go. Cool. Okay. Brainstorming, very popular here. You want to come up with all sorts of ideas, and again, no ideas are bad ideas. And so when you're doing your ideation phase, and ideation it just means sort of thinking in order to come up with ideas is what ideation means. And so again, this phase is all about coming up with ways to solve the problems you've identified, go wild and think outside the box, challenge assumptions about how to go about solving problems. And quickly, the tasks and deliverables here can include, or I guess in this case probably should include at the very least, thoughts about how navigation is going to be in sort of an abstract, broad sense, how users are going to interact in a navigation sense with the product. And from that, you might develop site maps, and it might be difficult to, ooh, wow, that blows up just nice. We have site maps, which is a less abstract understanding of and this is all sort of under the category of information architecture. Site maps are a visualization of all of the, for example, if this were a website, which kind of looks like it almost is, this would be a visual representation of the, I guess, HTML documents, or all the documents that a user could potentially find themselves on, and this gives gives meaning to the abstract collection of all the documents, and it shows hierarchy. And by that I mean it shows what, all these main navigations in the pink box. These are child elements of home, and they are siblings of each other, and they have children themselves, which are all these different subpages. And so it helps to visually convey how information is going to be organized. And so after that, you will also very, very frequently, I can't think of I'm sure they exist, but I can't think of a scenario in which a user experience designer was creating a product or working on a project and didn't concern themselves with creating user flows or red routes. And so this is an example of a user flow right here. And user flows are a representation sort of similar to sitemaps, but they use, I say different shapes, but they're used for something else. User flows are an illustration of how a user, or the steps a user needs to go through to accomplish a task. And so that might include which pages they find themselves on. And so, for example, the task might be send an email, or they get to the reset password page, or any number of different steps they could take. And very often when you see these diamond shapes, that is where a choice by the user is being made. And so very often, I think, and this looks like it was done in Miro. For example, if I don't know I didn't crop this. I don't know what the context of this image is, but based on the word email right here, I would think this has something to do with an email client, some sort of messaging program. However, if we look at first time here, we'll see two arrows coming off of first time, and the options here is first time, no, it's not the first time. Go to the dashboard if it is the first time. Sign an agreement and approve maybe terms of service or privacy policy, and then get to the dashboard. And so user flows are a representation of all the different steps a user will need to go through in order to accomplish a goal, whatever that goal happens to be. And red routes are sort of not an offshoot, but your red routes are the most your red routes, which might look a lot like your user flows, are representations of the most common tasks that the average user will want to accomplish in the most common way they'll want to accomplish that. And so if you are working on, we just use this as an example, if you are working on an email platform, it's likely that again, user research would show this to be the truth or not, the most common task a user may want to accomplish is sending an email message, sending email to somebody. And so, and the most common way they would do that might be, on the phone or on desktop. I'm thinking Gmail, and between the two, what are the most common ways someone does that? And for example, the most common way, at least on the desktop, might be go to gmail.com, and the keyboard shortcut is C for compose, but then maybe clicking on compose new mail, or whatever the button microcopy says at this moment. And so the red route will describe the most common tasks done in the most common way. And so at this page, this is part of your ideation phase. And it's the reason it's categories under, that coming up with red routes might sound like it's at odds with the concept of divergent thinking. And I could understand how that would be a concern. However, when developing red routes, when we're coming up with our user flows, as it says here, think outside the box and challenge assumptions about how to go about solving problems. There's not an assumed best way of doing things. There might be best practices that have been established over the years. For example, email and how users interact with email. However, that doesn't mean, and far from it, perish the thought that there's only one right way of doing things. Just because a process has been done the same way for decades, and I'm thinking maybe e-commerce or Gmail, it doesn't mean that there isn't room for improvement. And so even if it's something as banal as, again, to use the example, email or instant messaging or something like that, just because it's been done forever doesn't mean that there aren't undiscovered ways of doing it out there that may indeed work better. And so this is the point, to come up with all sorts of different ways or different ideas on how a user could solve a certain problem or complete a task or a goal. And again, the more people we have working on this, the better. Everyone has a different idea or a different concept, a different mental map of how something might work or how something could work. And when you're able to share ideas, when you're able to communicate different ideas with people and bounce ideas off of each other and mix ideas, remix ideas, you can come up with some pretty creative ways about going about solving problems. And so that is what makes the ideation phase a divergent, broad idea catching phase. And to move on, we have the prototype phase, which is a convergent phase. And if you caught the stream earlier this week, you may remember this series of images. And I spent a couple of minutes on Google image search trying to find appropriate images for this slide before I remembered that I did the work already. And so I want to keep it simple. I don't want to repeat myself. And so I just took a screenshot of those images and pasted it here. And so the prototype phase is way more easily understood than define phase. Of course, basically every phase is easier to understand than define, but this phase is all about bringing your ideas to life. Here in this phase, you will assess which ideas will work and won't based on numerous factors, and those factors are time, money, ability, team size. There will be all sorts of facets that will control what you're able to create, and time is usually one of the biggest ones. Time and money, and I suppose money is sort of a function of time, or possibly vice versa. However, the tasks and deliverables that you will do in the prototype phase, this may be self-explanatory, but I thought was including for the sake of being sort of, not a completionist, but having a holistic view or holistic understanding of each one of the phases. You might sketch out some wireframes, or you might work on some mock-ups. And just because these, you may not be able to tell, just because these are clearly sketches, and I did these in a sketchbook, doesn't mean that these can't be made in a design application like Figma, Sketch, Adobe XD. The tools aren't necessary. Well, the tools are important, and especially if you intend to collaborate or share. However, those prerequisites about what you'll need to be able to do, like how much collaboration needs to take place, how much, how easily shareable these things are, that will determine which tool you use. And then you'll also, you might create low fidelity prototypes. In addition to high fidelity prototypes, you might only create one of these. And just to say this one more time, by no means do I mean the lists below this type right here, or this text layer on each of these slides. By no means do I mean to indicate that these are the only deliverables that may be created, or these are the only tasks that will be done. And it's, again, entirely possible that you might do all of these, you might do more, you might do less. And as stated here, that will be an issue of time, money, ability, and also team size, and also necessity. A project manager might decide for any number of reasons that one or more of these steps is unnecessary, or we need to add some additional prototype class things. And so each product is going to be different, each project is going to be different. And so again, just like the empathize, define issue of, which deliverable goes where, even though the prototype phase is more easily understood which prototype goes where, or why we're creating each prototype, and they all definitely go in this phase. The more important takeaway is understanding why you're doing it and the order in which things are done. And so prototype is sort of a more easily explained sort of, I don't want to say it's easily understood, but it's an easier to explain phase in the design thinking process. And so moving in, before I go on, convergent, it is convergent because at this point, so in the ideation phase, we've come up with loads of different ideas about how to accomplish certain goals. And then once we have that series of ideas, we will narrow them down by considering, do we have time to implement that? Is our development team able to implement that? Will this even work? Do we have the money if we need to hire additional devs? Can we do that? And so when we consider, or when we judge each idea based on the factors that we have, some ideas they won't work out. It doesn't mean they were bad ideas. They could be fantastic ideas, and they may be more appropriate for a future iteration, or they may be parked until which time more money or more resources, we'll say, are available. But it just might be the case that a fantastic idea doesn't make it to the prototype, or doesn't make it to the screen, or doesn't get sketched. That's just the fact of the matter. And if you happen to be the originator of a great idea that doesn't make it, again, doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It could be the best idea in the world. It's just it didn't meet the requirements of the resources available. And so nothing to be offended about, of course, nothing personal. And so, yeah, it's convergent because it's a narrowing down, it's a distilling of the best idea, or the ideas that are most appropriate to the task. And so, from that, we will move on to the testing phase, which is, of course, the T in the EDIPT or EDIPT. So we're very close to the end here. The testing phase is all about bringing your prototypes to users and seeing just how well your ideas work. This is validation of your ideas. Do your hypotheses work? What needs to work, or what needs to work, what can stay? And there are, and not to go too deep into this, but there are two basic ways of testing. There's moderated and unmoderated. And I tried my best to find images that were adequately representative of the two types of testing. And so moderated testing is, again, they are what they sound like. Moderated testing is where if you are also wearing the hat of a UX researcher, you are observing the user while they are testing the prototype, testing the product out. And so you will, I should have included on this slide, but I forgot to. You'll have written a test script, or you'll be given a test script written by another team member who will write the script in order to validate the hypotheses. This is a testing phase for a number of, it's called that for a number of reasons. The first one is we want to make sure that, first and foremost, the way we implemented the solutions to the problems, do they work? When you click or tap something, does it react in a way that the devs expect it to? Does it break or anything like that? And the other reason for testing, and I would say the more important reason for testing, is not does it work, not does it work in a technical sense, but does it work for the user? Is the ideas that you came with, the idea that you came up with, is this going to work for the user? Is this a way that they're going to want to use to solve a particular problem, or whatever that problem may look like? When I say problem, I also mean, task or goal. For example, if the problem or the goal is find something to eat this evening, and you're working on possibly a restaurant review app or something like that, it's not necessarily a problem in the more literal sense of the word, but it's a problem in that it's an issue to be solved. And so I just want to be clear about that, what I mean when I say problem. And so moderated testing is you being present, or you the researcher, you're the one who's sort of proctoring the test. You're going to be present when the test is given. It won't be asynchronous. And I also want to be clear, and the image doesn't do a great job of this. Moderated testing can be done. It can definitely be done in person, as this image here would indicate. We have the user in red who is making comments about the prototype, and very helpfully we have the UX researcher who has the clipboard, the pen, looks to be thinking is wearing what I'm guessing is supposed to be a lab coat. And so moderated testing, you're watching the user, you're proctoring in real time. And I don't mean to give the impression that it's always in person. Of course, since the pandemic, a very popular way of doing not just since the pandemic, but especially since the pandemic, moderated testing that's done over Zoom or Google Meet or Skype or even Discord, or possibly even Slack. Those are very valid ways of doing the moderated testing. And so, and that's all the testing that I do is almost exclusively done via Zoom. And Zoom is a fantastic application for this sort of testing because I can send the link to a Figma prototype that I'm working on. They can open it, they'll screen share, and so I can see their screen and I can see their mouse cursor, and I'll give them I'll list to them the task, or I'll give them a goal that I want them to accomplish on the product, and I can watch them work on it in real time. And of course, you always ask the user when they're in the testing, when you're in a testing session, to think aloud, and so you can ask probing questions, and you can find out what they think about the UI patterns or how accessible they find it. And so these tools are extremely useful and they've definitely eased the burden of doing moderated testing when you're separated. By time zone and geography from users that you need to interact with in order to test your product. And as stated during last stream, there are a few downsides to this, of course. And the biggest downside, which is you'll find this in any application you use, and it's an inherent downside, is when you're not physically there with the person, it makes it much more difficult to judge their body language. And because all you see is it's video, but it's a 2D version of the person that you're testing with, and so they might be, depending on where the camera's facing, they might be gesticulating which is that's important body language, but you might not be able to see that. I gesticulate a lot, but I also know how large. I have a laptop to my left here, so I can watch the stream, and I know that 95% of the time, the gesticulations I make don't show up on camera, but I make them anyway because it's one of the ways that I communicate. And so the other way of testing is unmoderated testing, and unmoderated testing is, and I for a moment there I had a website in mind where it's possible to do or to set up unmoderated testing, and it might be maze.com or omaze, I forget, but unmoderated testing is a method of asynchronous testing where the UX researcher, or the UX team, I should say, will set up a prototype or host a prototype on a domain at a website, and they will write out, they'll have the script, but they'll write out a sort of alternate version of the script, which is basically instructions for a user to read. And so they'll read the instructions, and then they'll attempt to accomplish the task on their end and on their time. And there are some benefits, of course, and there's some pros and cons to each one of these. And of course, one of the bigger cons is you're not there to ask questions of the user. You'll just have to watch the video afterward, and so there might be loads of queries that you wish to make toward the user that you simply can't do because again it's asynchronous and they're doing it on their time. And also because you aren't watching them in real time, you'll be even less able to judge their body language. And so, but it also, unmoderated testing may be a great way to reach people or to get people to test who otherwise might not be able to test. And so again, pros and cons of each. There's also, and I won't go into this again, but there's also different compensation levels or different ways to compensate users for each of the testing ways. And so there's many pros, many cons of each type of testing. And of course, but you won't want to go into a project already in mind that we're going to do unmoderated testing, or we're going to start doing moderated testing. The type of testing that you do will be dependent on, again, the type of users that you need to test with, and it'll depend on a multitude of factors. And so don't tie yourself down to just one testing type before you understand what those factors are, because you want to make sure, especially if you're spending money on testing, that you get your money's worth when it comes to the type of results that you're looking for. You want high quality results. And so what you're looking for and all the different constraints that you have to deal with will inform what sort of testing that you do. And then getting toward the end here, and I've gone over this a few times now, just to hammer it home a bit further, even though, and this is a good image, even though a lot of the images, the visual representations of design thinking sort of indicate that it's a left to right stepwise process, and once you get to one phase, you stop caring about the previous phase, or you move on, and it's just like a click like that's a bad metaphor. The understanding is the entire process, it never stops. You might be in one phase and you're considering all the things you need to do for the next phase, but you're also might need to go back and do some additional work on the previous phase. For example, you might be in the ideation or the prototype phase, and you might realize you need or not realize that you need to, but you might go back and do maybe a little bit more user research, or you might go back and re-ideate on a few things. And so and again, this image or this illustration from the Nielsen Norman Group, nngroup.com, from their Design Thinking 101 series, does a fantastic idea of just sort of beating you over the head with the idea that it never stops. You never get to the testing phase, and then once you're done testing all your prototype with your users, you just say, okay, we're done. Like, no, you need to go right back to the beginning and start retesting things over and over again. Product design is never, you're never done with a product, ever. And so it can always be improved, and the need, and especially over time, the needs and the wants of your users are going to change. And so in order to not necessarily stay ahead of the curve, but in order to maintain a position of leadership in a certain space with regard to a certain category of product, you want to just constantly be thinking about the user and just research, and just continually going through these different phases to make sure that you're always coming up with the best product, and that the product is always meeting, or it's always answering the right question, and it's always solving the right problem. And so again, it never finishes, and it's users all the way down. If at any point you cease thinking about the user, you're going to run into problems, because one of the truisms in UX design is you are not the user, and when you stop thinking about the user, you become the user in a way, which is a funny way of saying it. When you stop thinking about the users, those who use your product, you become the user in that you start solving problems, that you start making up problems, or you start making up solutions to or answers to questions that may not exist, or you're going to come up with you're going to answer the wrong problem or answer the wrong question. And so by keeping your eyes focused and locked on the user, you're going to make sure that you're always answering the right questions and coming up with the right problems to the right answers to the right problems, right solutions to the right problems, I should say. And so never ever stop thinking about the user, and understand that you're going to be bouncing between phases all the time. That's just the nature of the game. Each product is different. And then this is the last slide, and this is sort of everything I wanted to say about design thinking and how it sort of compares and contrasts to human-centered design, or HCD. And I was unable to write it quick enough, and then I found this fantastic article on Medium, which I have a link to down here. And I will read this right quick. Design thinking is a problem-solving process. First, we begin understanding and scoping a clear problem, and next we focus on how we can solve it. Human-centered design, or HCD, is an approach to problem solving that has a focus on the people that you're designing a product for, the users. It starts by establishing who your user is and what their problem is, and then ends by finding a solution that is tailored to them. The core of human-centered design, something referred to as HCD, is deep empathy. This in turn helps designers to have an abundance of ideas, which feeds into building and then sharing a prototype with the ideal customer, and eventually putting the product or service to market. And very often you'll hear these two terms sometimes used interchangeably, but not very often, I suspect. What is human-centered design versus what is design thinking? And it's one of those things that the more it can be difficult to describe, especially to someone who doesn't work in user experience design, or work in UI, or work in the product development field. However, I think this is a pretty good job of explaining the difference between the two of them. And humans, another way to sort of put this is, design thinking is indeed a process. The process is what this entire stream has gone on about. It's the EDIPT, or EDIPT. It's the different phases and what's done in each phase. And also it's the understanding that you're going to tic-tac around a lot between which phase that you're in. Sometimes you go forward, sometimes you might need to go back, sometimes you're doing all three at once. And human-centered design is a less abstract title than design thinking. Human-centered design is essentially just that. Another way of thinking of that might be user-centered design, but that's not as good as human-centered design. It's the key aspect of human-centered design is always having the end user in mind when you're designing, or that's to say, regardless of which phase that you're on in the design thinking process, human-centered design means that you're always thinking about the user, and that's essentially the difference between the two, and they work together. You're not using just human-centered design and not using design thinking, or when you're using, the whole concept of design thinking is built around the idea of human-centered design. And so one is a tool set and one is a mindset. And so it's something to keep in mind when you are asked between what the difference between the two of these is. And again, every designer, every pro is going to have their own definition of what these two mean. And it's less important to fixate exactly on one definition or try to memorize one definition, but more importantly would be able to explain it simply to someone who's not in the UX field, or if a hiring manager were to ask you as part of the vetting process, what's the difference between the two of them, that would you would need to know enough to explain how they're similar and how they're different. And I think this quotation right here from this Medium article does a fantastic job of illustrating the difference between the two. And so that is it for this evening's stream. I hope you enjoyed it. And of course, if there are any questions, any concerns, or if you have any thoughts or opinions on the design thinking process or human-centered design, of course, feel free to send me a message on Twitch, or you can find me on Discord, Slack, Skype, at the normal places. If you know where I am, you know where I am. I'm always down to answer questions there. And of course, if you're watching this on Twitch, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can also sign up for notifications to receive a message when I go live. And I hope everyone has a very safe weekend, has a wonderful Friday, and I will see you next Tuesday with another stream. Have a good one.